Merci, merci beaucoup. Bonjour à tous.
Alors, je vous laisse vous équiper.
So I'll let you put on the equipment. Is it working? Can you hear me?
Yes. Okay. Alors, en préambule, je dirais que
As a preamble, I'd like to say that everything started in April 2020, I think, during the lockdown, or in French lockdown. We were preparing, or we were trying to keep busy, and we were thinking about the world, or the future world, the world that would happen after COVID, and we wanted to work on the United Kingdom, on the territory of the United Kingdom, and after a year, and a year before that, Middle England had just been published, and we thought that Jonathan Coe would be the perfect programmer for a new festival, for that new edition of the festival. So it was 2020. We had to postpone several times. I really wanted to thank Mr. Coe for being so obstinate, if you like, and to be here in 2021. I don't know if the world in 2020 is the same as it is in 2021, but maybe we can talk about this. We'll be talking about this depiction of Britain that Jonathan Coe has proposed, and then we'll talk about cinema, about writing, and depending on the time we have, and there'll be a few film clips that we can talk about. I'd like to start with a reading, just to tell you more about the little game we thought we'd play with Jonathan Coe by giving us a portrait, a depiction of England in 12 films. The idea came from Expo 58, and I'll read a short passage of the book, and the French translation is by José Camoun. So it's the beginning of the book, and talking about the World Exhibition organized in Brussels in '58. Brussels had livened things up a bit, that was certain. The COI had been given overall responsibility for the content of the British Pavilion Expo 58, and this had immediately led to a frenzy of head-scratching and soul-searching around that maddening, elusive topic of Britishness. What did it mean to be British in 1958? Nobody seemed to know. Britain was steeped in tradition, everybody agreed upon that. Its traditions, its pageantry, its ceremony were admired and envied all over the world. At the same time, it was mired in the past, scared of innovation, riddled with archaic class distinctions, enthralled to a secretive and untouchable establishment. Which way were you supposed to look when defining Britishness? Forwards or backwards? It was a difficult conundrum. So the question is simple. So we thought we'd try cinema through cinema. What does it mean to be British in 2021? It's a very broad question, but yeah, what does it mean to be British in 2021?
Yeah, it's a very broad question. And it's very unfair to read an old passage of mine that I haven't thought about since I wrote it probably in 2012, something like that, so 9 years ago. So yeah, I guess that passage poses the question very clearly: what does it mean to be British in 1958? And you know, the British establishment, who I show in that novel, trying to present an image of their own country to the World's Fair in Brussels in 1958, never really find a satisfactory answer to the question, and I can't give you a satisfactory answer to the question. And really, everything I do in terms of what I write is a prolonged attempt to answer that question. 13 novels now, 300 or 400 pages each, so I can't, and I still don't know the answer, so I can't give you an answer in 30 seconds, on a Saturday afternoon in Paris. It's too difficult.
J'ai juste essayé, tenté le coup, hein.
I tried my luck.
Yeah, I admire the attempt.
Mais à travers cette sélection de films,
But through that selection of films, we've seen quite a few since you arrived. Does one talk of a British identity or an English identity?
I prefer, particularly nowadays, to be specific about this and talk about English identity, because one of the things that has become very clear in the so-called United Kingdom in the last 5 or 6 years is that English identity is very different to Scottish and Welsh and Northern Irish identity. And you know, 1 or 2 of the films that I chose venture outside England. I'm thinking of I Know Where I'm Going, the Michael Powell film from the 1940s, which is showing tomorrow. But even that, in a very gentle, affectionate, and sometimes romantic way, dramatizes a conflict, a very strong conflict between English identity and Scottish identity, you know, which has been played out in many other more, you know, harsher and more dramatic films since then. So I would definitely talk of English identity and, you know, Brexit, because we have to use the word. We might as well use it early in the event so that this terrible taboo subject is out in the open, has really thrown those contrasting national identities into strong relief and contrast.
Mais précisément, donc vous décrivez cette
But the way you describe this shift, if you like, the passage from the national nation to nationalism, isn't there a danger to talk about identity for a country? It's a problem we have here, certainly.
I think it's very dangerous, because yes, then what you very quickly find, and we found very quickly in 2016, is that people have very different ideas of national identity, and these ideas of national identity are extremely emotional and deeply felt. It's something that it's extremely hard to have a rational, calm, and generous conversation about. It quickly becomes confrontational and bitter, and the Brexit referendum campaign of the first half of 2016 was one of the bitterest and ugliest political moments in Britain that I can remember. You know, I guess it's interesting that you chose to read that extract from Expo 58, because that was really the first time that I found myself confronting this issue explicitly. You know, it's like so many things, it seems almost accidental how you choose the subject of a book, but actually when you scratch the surface and look underneath, it's not. There are deeper, more subconscious things going on, and in some ways, my memory is that I chose to write Expo 58 in a kind of random way because a Belgian journalist decided she wanted to do an interview with me at the Atomium just outside Brussels, and it was her choice of venue, and I'd never been to the Atomium, and I didn't really know anything about it. But I went along with it because it sounded, it was what she wanted to do, and it sounded an interesting idea. And as soon as I saw this edifice, this amazing retro futurist monument on the outskirts of Brussels, I wanted to find out more about why it was built and what it was built for, and that got me into the whole subject of Expo 58, and also got me into the idea of a story about how the British took part in this fair and how that would have made them start asking questions about their own national identity. So I came into it by that route. But, you know, I don't think that would have happened if subconsciously and intuitively I hadn't wanted to start addressing this subject anyway.
Vous déclarez souvent, en tout cas, enfin, c'est vrai qu'on vous associe souvent à une identité.
You're often associated to a European identity. You call yourself a European writer, maybe more than English, and you say that the English identity is being diluted, for better or for worse, to European identity. What is that European identity for you? Is it on a political level? Is it on a literary level, through your reading, through your references?
It's partly on a literary level, I think, that, I always say that the first novel that really inspired me and made me want to become a novelist myself was a very old one, Tom Jones by Henry Fielding, which is often thought of as being the first English novel and is often it's also often noticed that it's heavily indebted to and inspired by a European novel, because the foundation of the English comic novel really can be traced back to Cervantes and Don Quixote, from him through Fielding, through Smollett, through Sterne, through Dickens, and so on. So even though Fielding is thought of as a very English writer, whatever that means, to me, he's also a very European writer, because Tom Jones is a homage to Cervantes. And, behind and before Cervantes, you have Rabelais. So even the comic, ironic tradition that I tend to work in, which, because of people like Fielding and Dickens, P.G. Wodehouse, Evelyn Waugh, David Lodge, and so on, is thought of as an English thing. To me, that is a European tradition, first of all.
Et est-ce que vous diriez la même chose du cinéma que vous aimez?
Would you say the same thing about the cinema that you like?
Well, in terms of Europeanness and Englishness, I grew up watching cinema from America and from Britain and from Europe, because obviously when I was first starting to watch films, when I was still a kid and in my early teens, so in the late 60s and early 1970s, the means by which you could do this were very primitive compared to what we have now. There was no Netflix, no streaming, no DVDs, no Blu-ray, none of this. So I was growing up in a suburb outside Birmingham where the cinemas were just showing the latest commercial releases. So to get a wider education than that in cinema, you watched TV and imbibed whatever it was that the TV schedulers decided to show you. So there were often during the afternoons, so during the school holidays and this kind of thing, I would watch old British films because that's what they tended to show. In the evenings, you often got, American classics, and you would see the great John Ford, Howard Hawks kind of films, but also because of the second BBC channel, BBC Two, we had wonderful seasons, carefully programmed seasons of great European directors like Fellini and Buñuel, the French New Wave directors. It was a great education in cinema, and an education in cinema that you didn't have to do anything to get. It was free, it was there, it was just coming into your home. But it was also random. You didn't get to choose the films. The TV programmers got to choose the films. And, the way younger people, I guess, discover cinema now is not like that anymore. They have incredible choice. You can find anything you want, more or less, on Netflix or Mubi or Amazon Prime. But at the same time, how do you choose which films you're going to see? Do you let the algorithm choose it for you? Well, that's not always very reliable. And I think I was very fortunate to have people basically curating my film choices for me back then. And yeah, they were British, American, and European equally, I would say.
C'est ce que vous écrivez dans le journal d'une obsession.
It's what you write in the journal of an obsession, or the diary of an obsession, a text you dedicated to the wildest Sherlock Holmes, that it's a sacrilege to take a film and watch it bit by bit and to stop it, and the real gods were TV programmers or cinema programmers. Do you still agree with that?
Je dis ça parce qu'on va passer un extrait.
I'm saying this because we'll show a clip in a second.
Clips are fine. Yeah, I think something has changed quite profoundly in the way we consume films, because now a lot of the time I certainly watch films at home, streaming or on my computer, and yes, you even even someone like me who wrote those words 20 or so years ago, still now I'm quite happy to pause the film and get up and make a cup of tea or go and do something else for a bit or something like that. So the rhythm that the director has worked so hard to create is not so respected anymore. I think the viewer imposes their own rhythm, which is more democratic in a way, but something there has been lost. And I find it on the rare occasions now when I actually go to a cinema to watch a film, that the task of sitting still, uninterrupted and undistracted, and watching a 2-hour movie, it's great. It's a wonderful thing to do, but it's become a kind of task. It's not how I'm used to watching films anymore.
C'est ce qui rapprocherait le cinéma de l'expérience musicale, enfin d'écouter un morceau.
So it brings cinema closer to listening to music, maybe, and it's different to reading, because when you read, you have to put down your book from time to time. Do you take that into account when you write a book, that people are going to have an interrupted reading when they read, or when you compose music? Because for those who don't know, Jonathan is also a composer and a musician.
Well, yes, it's been built into the way that we consume literature, the novel, for hundreds of years. So, I would never expect a reader of mine to sit down and read one of my books from beginning to end without any interruption. Of course not. But we do expect, or we have expected historically, to see films that way, and we don't anymore. So that's a change, I think, in that medium. Definitely.
C'est vrai que pour finir sur
and it's true, there's an object which is a very important character, which is the video player, which is used by Thomas, the industrial, the character, the industrialist. And you say that the raison d'être of the video recorder was to be able to pause on the screen. So they're a bit peculiar, because if you read the book, you know what he likes. But the video player was certainly a revolution for cinema buffs. The fact that you can change and modify and play with the film, and you've used that in What a Carve Up.
Okay.
It wasn't really a question. There was no question, so okay, no reply. But we have in the list that you gave us, there's a trailer. There were 12 films that you showed here, and we asked you contemporary films from the year 2000s or 2010s, and 2 films. There were 2 exceptions, one from the 80s, one from the 90s, and we'll compare them maybe. So we'll see a trailer. The film is quite unusual, and the trailer was a really good way to get into that crazy film. So just watch the film. So it's clip number 5 for the technician.
This hospital is run on £125 million of your money every year!
Whatever is happening in Britannia Hospital.
Oh, what you got in here then?
One geriatric, hypothermia.
No admissions except by union dispensation.
This could be a major confrontation. Stick close to me, lad.
This is not what was ordered.
I'm afraid His Excellency's mango slices have been delayed. This is the best we can do.
Intensive here, Ken. Looks like a Kroger.
OK, pass him through.
Where'd you want it?
I couldn't care less. I've been off duty for the past 10 minutes. What a light.
Come in, Sammy. Come in, Red. Are you receiving me?
Come on. Let's make movies. Hey, come back! Movies!
You're only being paid for an 8-hour day, Mr. Potter.
You'll have to be out of here by 10 at the latest.
They're refusing to admit the royal luncheons.
We have a royal occasion here today, you know.
They're picketing the Fortnum's van.
I didn't have 50 years in India to end up bedding down with a lot of wogs.
Oh!
This isn't a Nairobi Hilton.
Where the hell have you been?
This is a British hospital!
Today, the human experiment.
Left lung 2 seconds slow.
Tomorrow,
Liver and lights trailing 6 seconds.
Genesis.
Remember the Battle of Britain?
Remember the Peasants' Revolt?
We're all on the same side, lads.
Not in a class war, we're not. Not in the inevitable march of socialism, Potter.
Superintendent, can you guarantee the safety of HRH?
Honoured to meet you, ma'am.
She's as safe here as in Windsor Castle.
They've been provoked beyond endurance.
This is disgraceful.
HRH must be protected. This is no good. Get her inside now.
Alors vous aurez vous avez deviné.
So I guess you recognized Lindsay Anderson's Britannia Hospital. Why did you choose this film, made in '82? That was the first chronologically on your list. It's quite a crazy film from a great director from free cinema.
Yeah, but you didn't program it, right?
Non, on ne l'a pas programmé, c'est la raison parce qu'on n'a pas.
No, we didn't,
des raisons parfois de copie, etc.
Sometimes there are print reasons.
Comme il était dans la liste,
but
la
as it
première
was
liste,
in your list, on the first list, it was important to give you the opportunity to talk about it.
En tout cas, juste voilà pourquoi ce
just
film
why
arrive.
All of a sudden you chose this film.
Que vous en avez, qu'est-ce qu'il
and
représente
what memory do
dans
you keep of it? What does it represent of English cinema and England?
Well, one of the things that always interests me about British cinema is this tension between realism and what, for want of a better word, we could call poetry. As you know, Truffaut said this famous thing that there was a contradiction between the words cinema and Britain, or cinema and England. I can't remember which one he said, and he. The problem he had with British cinema was that he felt it was too tied to realism, too close to the theatre, and what I like about Lindsay Anderson's films in particular, and there are only 3 or 4 films that he made because he was a director active in the 60s and 70s and 80s who found it very hard to raise the money for his movies in the UK. What I like about his films is that they are not realistic, primarily, that he draws on the energies of popular culture, of surrealism. His films are very political, very violent, very funny, and very angry. And his first major success was a film called If, which I think won the Palme d'Or at Cannes in 1968 or 69. And a few years later, more than a decade later, he made this film, Britannia Hospital, which, as you can tell from the title, uses the idea of a hospital in London as a metaphor for the state of the nation as a whole. And he draws a very energetic and strange and eccentric portrait of a country which is pulled apart by class distinctions, because you have private wards and you have public wards, obsessed with tradition because you have a royal visit, which, and at the same time, there is a huge political protest going on outside the hospital. And all these plot strands run together into a kind of violent, farcical conclusion. And the film was really maligned and hated, and a tremendous failure in Britain in 1982 when it was released, because this was a couple of years into the prime ministership of Margaret Thatcher, just after the Falklands War, and Britain was going through a very different moment, a moment of kind of new patriotic fervour, among Mrs. Thatcher's supporters about the new direction that the country was taking. So it was released at a very bad time, but when you see it now, I think, 40 years later, it's an incredibly strangely accurate portrait of the tensions that underpinned British life then and underpin it still.
Alors, un deuxième film des années 80.
Another film of the 90s that we didn't program that we're going to talk about because it was inspired by a moment that is very important for you. That's the poster that we're going to see right now. First image. The remains of the day. So that's something very different in terms of atmosphere and mise en scène. What makes you think that James Ivory's film is also part of the British identity? And the Nobel Prize Ishiguro, who's at the origin, the author of the novel, is among your favorite books that for you says exactly what Britain is.
Yeah, I chose this film not so much for its cinematic qualities, but because it's a very faithful adaptation of Ishiguro's novel. And he, I think, is a very interesting writer and has a very interesting take on Britishness because, of course, he's Japanese by birth and although he lived in England for nearly all of his life, he still has a slight outsider's take on it, I think. And I like this novel very much because it's a study of English emotional repression, if you like. This is one of the kind of slightly stereotypical views that people from outside England have of the English, that we're not in touch with our emotions, that we don't express our emotions very articulately. And Ishiguro's novel tells the story of a butler who nurses a passion for the maid who he's working alongside, and he's never able to say anything about it to her until it's too late. And at the same time, what you realize through the activities of the family who he's waiting on is that his blindness to his own feelings is also blinding him to what's going on around him. And in fact, what's going on in the political meetings that are happening in the house where he works is a process of British people enabling fascism, supporting fascism in the run-up to the Second World War. So it draws very subtle and I think beautiful analogies between the idea of emotional repression and political naivety or ignorance. And in that way, I think it's one of the most interesting British films of the 90s, and a companion piece in a way to Stephen Frears' The Queen, which we did show, which of course dramatizes the moments around the death of and the funeral of Princess Diana, at which point the British very dramatically threw off their emotional restraints, if you like, and suddenly indulged in this week-long orgy of mourning and grief, occasioned by the death of a woman who none of them had known personally. It was a very strange and pivotal moment, I think, in the recent history of my country, and Stephen Frears' film captures that really interestingly.
Eh bien, merci pour cette transition toute trouvée, parce qu'on a un extrait de The
Thank you for this wonderful transition, because we're about to watch a clip of The Queen. It's a very interesting excerpt. It's the first meeting between Tony Blair, Michael Sheen, and the Queen. Maybe you can sit on the first row, Jonathan, if you want to watch this 40-minute excerpt, if you wish to, so that you don't have to get towards it. So this is clip number 2.
The audience room is upstairs. When we reach the audience room, I will knock. We will not wait to be called. We shall go straight inside. Standing by the door, we bow from the neck. I will introduce you. The Queen will extend her hand. You go to her, bow again, then shake her hand. A couple of other things. It's ma'am as in ham, not ma'am as in farm. And when you're in the presence, at no point must you show your back.
The presence?
Yes, sir. That's what it's called when you're in Her Majesty's company. Would you like to sit there, Mrs. Blair?
How nice to see you again, Mr. Blair. And congratulations.
Thank you.
Children must be very proud.
Well, I hope so.
You've 3, haven't you?
That's right.
Oh, how lovely. Such a blessing, children. Please, do sit down.
Thank you.
Have we shown you how to start a nuclear war yet?
No.
Oh, first thing we do, apparently. Then we take away your passport and spend the rest of the time sending you around the world.
Well, you obviously know my job better than I do.
Yes, well, you are my 10th Prime Minister, Mr. Blair. My first, of course, was Winston Churchill. He sat in your chair in frock coat and top hat. He was kind enough to give a shy young girl like me quite an education.
I can imagine.
With time, one has hopefully added experience to that education and a little wisdom, better enabling us to execute our constitutional responsibility. To advise, guide, and warn the government of the day.
Advice which I look forward to receiving.
Yes, well, we'll save that for our weekly meetings. If there's nothing else, I believe we have some business to attend to.
Of course. Your Majesty, my party has won the election, and so I come now to ask your permission to form a government.
No, Mr. Blair. Mr. Blair, I asked the question. The duty falls upon me as your sovereign to invite you to become Prime Minister and to form a government in my name. If you agree, the custom is to say yes.
Yes.
Mrs. Blair, lovely to see you again. And congratulations. You must be very proud.
Yes.
And exhausted, I imagine. Where will you be spending the summer?
France.
Oh, lovely.
You'll be in Balmoral, I expect.
Yes, yes, I can't wait. It's a wonderful place. You know, my great-great-grandmother Victoria said of it, in Balmoral all seems to breathe freedom and peace and make one forget the world and its sad turmoils.
Your Majesty.
Oh, excuse me. Oh, really?
Yes, we need to know how to respond.
Yes, of course. I'm so sorry, we're going to have to leave it there. Not too short, was it? 15 minutes? One doesn't want to be rude.
No.
Voilà, donc Stephen Frears, donc vous avez peut-être pu voir.
So maybe you could see the film that was presented the day before yesterday by Jonathan, and here we can see the collision between the politician and royalty, this very old-fashioned protocol, and this new prime minister and his triumphant new liberalism that you described in the close cycle, the second part of your trilogy. What does this scene inspire to you?
Well, first of all, it gives me a kind of nostalgia, I suppose, for that year, for 1997, the year that Labour won its landslide victory. Of course, things quickly went wrong for Tony Blair in ways which couldn't have been imagined at the time that scene is set. And he made this disastrous, in my opinion, decision to support George W. Bush in the war against Iraq, and the nation's mood towards Blair and New Labour quickly began to turn sour after that. But at the time, when he'd just been elected after 18 years of Conservative rule, he felt like a breath of fresh air, and it was a very exciting moment. What I like very much about the Stephen Frears film is not just these nice little vignettes where moments of great kind of archaic formality and almost comic and surreal formality. And you can see how in the hands of a director like Lindsay Anderson a few years earlier, a scene like that might be pushed even further to show the kind of the bizarre theatre that underpins these institutions and these rituals. What you get in the Stephen Frears film is also a great deal of original news footage of the public display of mourning outside Buckingham Palace, interviews with members of the public who'd come there to mourn her, and who were, pouring out these spontaneous expressions of feeling and emotion, which were the very antithesis of the way that you see the Queen and the Prime Minister behaving to each other in that very awkward but somehow charming encounter.
J'ai l'impression que Stephen Frears est assez proche de votre...
Stephen Frears seems quite close to your way of working. In this film, as you said, he uses documentary footage referring to real people and having this irony, this sharpness without doing too much of it, being very subtle. It's the mood of many of your books, especially the trilogy, Language trilogy. Do you feel close to him? I think he's the director who's closest to your world.
Maybe the contemporary British director who is closest to my work. Yeah, I would think. And the Queen in some ways is one of his less personal and less idiosyncratic films, and he draws a very, very different portrait of British society in something like My Beautiful Laundrette, which dramatizes a much earlier time, the early 1980s, when British attitudes towards homosexuality, towards multiculturalism were starting to change. And in that film, in the early 80s, he made a very bold and radical portrait of Britain, which was tremendously influential, I think. Similarly, in a film I think he made shortly after the Queen, Dirty Pretty Things, he shows the plight of immigrants who've come to the UK and are working for low wages and so on, living a kind of underground existence in London. And yet at other times, yes, he takes on these big kind of national moments and these interesting historical subjects, and always treats them with a certain kind of dry irony and wit, which, if you've met Stephen Frears, as I think you have, is very characteristic of the man himself.
Alors on ne peut pas traverser toute la filmographie
We can't cross all the filmography of your choices for this carte blanche, but I would like to talk also a bit about your own style, your way, your method of writing. You often say, you have said at least, and being English yourself, you keep asking, thinking, wondering about the country in which you live. So maybe it's a question a bit too obvious, but Does writing help you understand better the world in which you live? When you start a book, do you already have a plan of what you're going to develop, or are there things that you discover as you go, especially for Middle England, it was really close to the reality that was going on. So what's your method? How do you discover yourself mysteries as you write?
I think it's an interesting question, and it's changed a lot for me in the 35 years or so, 34 years that I've been a published writer. I know in France, my first popular book was Testament à l'Anglaise, What a Carve-Up, and still I meet a lot of readers in the UK, in France, in other countries for whom this is my favourite of their books. The reservation I have myself about What a Carve-Up is that, looking back on it now, to me, it seems a little bit like what Milan Kundera would refer to as a thesis novel, in that it was preconceived, if you like, as an anti-Thatcher satire, and I'd already made up my mind before I wrote the book what I thought about the subject of the book, which was Thatcherism. I knew it was going to be an attack on that. So it was not so much for me a voyage of discovery. I mean, it was a very satisfying and cathartic book to write, but by contrast, a book like Middle England, Le Cœur de l'Angleterre, was completely written in a different spirit, which I guess I would call the spirit of inquiry. Because unlike some commentators and thinkers and observers of the British scene who were more prescient than me, I was very surprised by the Brexit referendum result. As the campaign unfolded, it became clear that it was going to be a close vote, but I still thought that we would vote to retain our close links with the other countries in the European Union. And, I decided to write that book completely in order to but to ask and explore the question for myself, why did we do this? What is it about the British and the English specifically, which makes them feel they are different to the other European countries, more special than the other European countries in some ways? Is it simply a fact of geography? Is it to do with our status as an island nation, or is there something more fundamental than that, and has there been a skepticism about our relation with the rest of Europe which has underpinned British life for many years or decades or centuries before this? I wrote that book in order for my own satisfaction to try to understand my own country better, and by extension, myself, because my sense of Englishness, which is something I was born with and have no choice about really, is sometimes, a weight that you carry around you. This is another of the dangers that you alluded to when you said it can be dangerous to ask questions of national identity, because national identity can be a burden as well as something that you invest in and feel proud of. And the result of the Brexit referendum gave me a much more uncomfortable relationship with my own Englishness than I'd had before.
Vous dites dans le cercle fermé que, notamment en politique,
in the close circle, you say that, especially in politics, what's important is not what we say, but the way things are interpreted. So it's not just about the content. And to try and answer this, I think your narrative technique is to mix all kinds of registers. It can be a diary, it can be a script. So that's a broad question, but how did you come up with this way of mixing the different ways of writing? Is it a way to try and get closer to the truth of the book?
You keep bringing up these things that I wrote in my books 15 or 16 years ago. You know, you've obviously read them last week. I haven't read them since I wrote them, so I can't address the specific quotations, if you like. But I think it's one of the problems you face as a writer every time you start a new book is the question of perspective and from whose point of view you're going to be telling the story. And I don't often use first-person narration because I find it too restricting. And when I do use first-person narration, as in The Rain Before It Falls or Mr. Wilder and Me, I often write in the voice of a woman rather than a man because that in itself gets me out of myself. So what I'm constantly trying to do is to, escape my own narrow perspective, really, as the person of the background and education and age and gender that I am, and to try to find a perspective that is more objective and more all-encompassing. And in the 19th century, the great political and social novelists like Dickens or Hugo or Balzac would have done this by adopting an omniscient third-person narrative perspective, but it's very difficult to write like that now for some reason. It feels like a privilege that no writer really is able to earn in the present moment. So, starting with What a Carve Up, I tried to start evolving a technique which would allow me to leap from different points of view, different modes of writing, even different genres of writing rapidly to give, I suppose maybe even in a cinematic way, a different perspective on each scene. So, some of it will be written in the third person, then you will shift into a diary extract, then you will shift into a letter, then you will shift into the transcript of a TV broadcast or something like this. And, it's all an attempt really to kind of replicate that omniscient 19th century narrative voice, which, for me at least, is not really accessible to us anymore.
Toujours dans le cercle fermé, il y a une très belle page où le personnage...
Still in the closed circle, there's a very beautiful page in which the character is speaking, and the way she tries and find the logic in things, starting from one attack, try and find the causes, that nothing is accidental. And at the same time, you're interested in coincidences, in conducting accidents. In Jonathan Coe's world, there's no necessity, but just coincidences, just as Brexit must have been just a series of awkward coincidences, also those caused by David Cameron. So this idea of going back to the causes, to the origins, is it a way of trying to give sense to this world that doesn't have any sense? So I feel I'm like in the very first pages of Le Cœur de l'Angleterre, where there is this confrontation between the French writer and the English writer, and the moderator in the middle who's asking over-complicated questions, and the writer who's pontifying. I'm afraid my questions might be too complicated. I'm sorry.
It is a complicated question, but that's okay.
Thank you.
I have always been interested in the idea of accident, and indeed my first published novel, going way back to the 1980s in English, was called The Accidental Woman. In French, it's called Une femme par hasard or de hasard. Can't remember. La femme de hasard. Thank you. My translator just told me that in my voice, in my ear. And there's a. As I was saying to you, I don't remember much about some of my earlier novels, but I do remember very clearly a chapter in that book which ends with the heroine, Maria, making a choice in a restaurant to eat gammon, a very salty kind of ham. And the next chapter begins as a result of choosing to eat gammon in the restaurant that day. 5 years later, she is sitting with her husband, to whom she is unhappily married. And then the next paragraph tells you the process of cause and effect by which this one seemingly random choice in a restaurant led to her making a bad choice of husband. And actually, since writing that, I think I've come around to the idea that although these accidents, the kind of butterfly effect, this random chain of cause and effect is the symptom of something, actually what's more interesting is the deeper undercurrents which lead us in a particular direction. So in Le Coeur de l'Angleterre, at the very beginning, you have this scene where the then Prime Minister, Gordon Brown, accidentally, while live on air, calls a woman who he's just had an exchange with in the street. He calls her a bigoted woman. And it's a quirk of the fact that someone had forgotten to turn his microphone off, or Gordon Brown himself had not remembered that he was still mic'd up, and as a result, this comment became broadcast, and in a way, it ended his election campaign and brought him down, allowed David Cameron to take over as Prime Minister, and from there you can trace the path to Brexit. So in a way you could say that Brexit happened because of this accidental moment, but of course that's not really the explanation. Brexit was something that was waiting to happen, and waiting to happen because of something in the English psyche. So the accidental things are the kind of surface manifestations of this, and there is something deeper going on underneath, which is what I'm these days more interested in trying to tease out in the books.
Alors, pour avancer et continuer d'alambiquer les questions.
To go further in my complex questions, and it's not the main tone of all your books, and there are books that are in satire. Think of The House of Sleep, for instance. But you're often called the great political satirist of British literature. And you've also said that humour, we're talking about English identity, English could not be dissociated from the British discourse on all levels, like a code, if you like, that's been developed throughout the centuries to never really say what one thinks or not in a direct way. Can you tell me more about this idea tell me more about British humour and the way you use it in your books?
Well, before we get on to how I use it in my books, I think the great, obvious, glaring example of the danger of the British sense of humour at the moment is our Prime Minister. And somebody asked me recently who I thought was the most, not the best, but the most influential British satirist, satirical writer of the last few decades. And I thought about it and said, well, actually, I think it's Boris Johnson, because Johnson, as you may know, began his career as a journalist for The Telegraph and The Times, reporting from Brussels and reporting on the workings of the European Parliament, which he presented to his readers as farce, as ridiculous. And he created this tremendous myth, and tremendously influential myth, which other journalists started to imitate, about how Brussels was full of bureaucrats who just wanted to stop us eating bendy bananas and to dictate the shape of our sausages and this kind of thing. And this became the dominant narrative about what the European Union was in terms of its relationship to Britain. And those reports were not journalism. They presented themselves as journalism, but they weren't. They were satire. They were caricature. And the British kind of bought it, really, because often what is funny, what is humorous, is easier to absorb and more pleasurable to absorb than the truth, which is usually boring, mundane, and complex. And humor, to me, among other things, is a great simplifying tool. But you can use it in two ways. You can either simplify the situation down into the truth, or you can simplify it down into a lie. And of course, as I would say, what I try to do with humor in my own books is to use it as a way of making readers see the truth clearly and quickly and economically, because that's what a great joke can do. As I try to write in that passage in Mr. Wilder and Me, where Billy Wilder's screenwriting collaborator, the great comic writer I.A.L. Diamond, tells the narrator a joke, and his face kind of lights up, because for him a joke is a moment of clarity, a moment when the complexity of the world kind of falls away, and in a deeply pleasurable and liberating way you see the truth for a moment for what it is.
Vous aviez analysé cet on va dire avènement de Boris Johnson avant même.
Did you analyze that vision of Boris Johnson before he became Prime Minister as an anti-establishment comic? How can one continue into writing satire when the world itself has become a satire, has become pure entertainment somehow? And you talk about the perversion of self-deprecate or being self-deprecating, if you like. And you talked about that in politics. So how can we keep using satire? How does it want to go through the pamphlet as you do, which is something that is more direct somehow?
Well, as I said, in a novel like Le Cœur de l'Angleterre, I'm not really writing in a satiric mode, I would say, in the same way that I was in What a Carve-Up, because I'm not trying to prove a thesis by humour. The humour in that novel really is more a kind of comedy of human interaction, which provides kind of moments of lightness and relief, I guess, from the heavier political things that are going on in the book. It's been, you're absolutely right, that in a way, satirists like me, who come from, if you like, the liberal left, have been very much wrong-footed and caught off our guard in the last decade, because many of the most important and influential political figures of the moment are comics in one way or another. If you look at the way Donald Trump speaks at his rallies, he's trying to be a stand-up comic. He's not a political rhetorician in the traditional sense. He models himself, I think, on the American comic Rodney Dangerfield, and tells these kind of self-deprecating stories, and he's getting his audience on side by humor, and he does it. Even though I don't find what he says particularly funny, it's very brilliant in terms of the fact that he achieves a genuine rapport with his supporters. So the politician as clown is becoming a more and more dangerous figure. I think we now have a clown politician. Even Putin, I think, some people attribute the real rise to influence of Vladimir Putin to appearances he made on the Larry King show in America about 20 years ago, when again he developed this way of kind of talking about himself with a kind of ironic wink, which on the one hand enables you to dodge the truth, and on the other hand enables you to build a complicity with your audience and your supporters. And those of us who want to use humor in a different way are kind of have beaten a little bit of a retreat, I think, and biding our time and trying to think of how to counterattack, if you like. So the novel I'm writing at the moment, even though it concerns the state of my nation in 2020, again, won't be particularly satirical, I think, because at the moment, for the present moment, in a strange way, satire belongs to the right.
Comment vous percevez, si on fait
How do you perceive, if we talk about what's happening in France at the moment, how do you perceive the French presidential campaign that's starting? If you're aware of it at all, because we have the feeling that we are living something that you experienced in Britain a few years ago, as if you're always ahead of us.
Yeah, I'm not going to comment on French politics because I'm not an expert, but I sense a lot of despair actually among the people who I'm talking to about the forthcoming elections, not just in terms of the alternatives that are available, and in terms of the fact that the far right in particular has, as I understand it, a new and potentially very influential figure emerging who himself uses humor as a way of ingratiating himself with the public, a figure who, from what I've heard about him, looks to me a little bit like the French equivalent of Nigel Farage, who, even though he was never a mainstream politician in the UK, is probably the single politician, the possible exception of Boris Johnson, who has made the biggest difference to the direction Britain has taken in the last 20 years. So these figures who come from outside, who position themselves as outsiders, and use humor and irony to smuggle, in a way, quite extreme ideas into the political mainstream, I think are very dangerous and to be watched carefully.
Alors, on va parler de Mr. Wilder and Me, en tout cas.
We'll talk about Mr. Wilder and Me. Billy Wilder was someone who used irony really well, but also melancholy, with having a very fine balance between these two moods. Would it be okay if I ask you to read the beginning of Mr. Wilder and Me in English, so we can hear the author reading? It's always a great moment. So the first page. So for those who want to listen to the translation, they will hear Marguerite Capel's translation, published by Gallimard. But can I ask you to read the very beginning of the book, and then we can talk about it. Up to here.
Okay, I can read it, but this passage has nothing to do with Billy Wilder. It's not a problem?
No.
No, okay, good, right. One winter's morning, 7 years ago, I found myself on an escalator. It was one of the escalators that takes you up to street level from the Piccadilly line platforms at Green Park Station. If you've ever used those escalators, you will remember how long they are. It takes about a minute to ride from the bottom to the top, and for a naturally impatient woman like me, a minute standing still is too long. Even though I was not in any particular hurry that morning, I soon began walking up the escalator, easing my way past the line of stationary passengers on the right-hand side, thinking to myself all the while, I may be almost 60, but I've still got it, I'm still fit. Until about 3/4 of the way up, I found myself stuck. A young mother was standing on the right-hand side, and on the left, holding her hand, was her daughter, a girl of maybe 7 or 8. She had blonde hair and was wearing a red plastic mac with a hood that made her look a bit like the little girl who drowns at the beginning of Don't Look Now. Everything makes me think of a film, I can't help it. There wasn't room to push past her, and in any case, I didn't want to rupture this lovely moment of connection between a mother and her child. So I waited until they reached the top of the escalator, and then I watched as the little girl prepared herself to jump off. Even from behind, I could sense her anticipation, the way her eyes must have been fixing themselves on the moving track ahead with concentrated energy, the coiled readiness in her tiny limbs and muscles, and then, when the moment arrived, the sudden fierce movement as she leapt forward and landed safely on terra firma, following which, no doubt relieved and elated by the maneuver, she performed 2 little skips, still clasping her mother's hand and pulling her slightly forward in the process. And I think it must have been these skips more than anything else that made my heart flip, that made me catch my breath, that made me watch in wonder and longing as the mother and her daughter headed off towards the ticket barrier together. It made me think at once of my own daughters, Francesca and Ariane, children no longer, and how for them, when they were 7 or 8 years old, the mere act of walking was sometimes not enough. It must have felt simply too ordinary, too boring to express the intensity of their delight in motion, in the joyous novelty of their relation to the physical world, which meant that sometimes they too would randomly break into a skip or a hop, and in the process they would carry me forwards with them, each of them clasping one of my hands, and sometimes I would skip too to keep up with them and to show them that I was also capable of sharing their joy in the world, that middle age had not yet drained it out of me.
Merci. On peut remercier Jonathan.
Thank you.
Alors, comment vient ce début? Comment on
how do you start? How does one start a book? How did this beginning come to you? What's important in the way you start a book when you open a book, especially in that book?
This is a book partly about cinema, not just about cinema, but obviously the story it tells is a story of Billy Wilder, age 70, and his making of one of his final films, Fedora. And when you begin a book, you have a choice of ways to start a book. You have an infinite range of ways in which you can start a book. One of the images that came to me was this idea of a woman riding an escalator and seeing another younger woman ahead of her with holding a little girl's hand, and the little girl skipping off the escalator at the top. And I guess, more or less subconsciously, I chose this image to start the book because to me, it feels cinematic, and I can imagine it with a camera behind the 2 women following up the escalator and the motion of the escalator imitating a tracking shot in a movie. So that was the kind of abstract idea that lay behind my choice of starting the book like that. But at the same time, there's an emotional moment taking place here. You're inside the head of a woman for whom motherhood has clearly been important and is now feeling kind of nostalgia for that now that her daughters have begun to grow up and leave home. So it also seemed to me a good way of introducing the reader to Callista, my narrator, as she is in late middle age, and telling her not everything, of course, about her situation in life, but beginning to hint towards it, to gesture towards it. So all of these ideas and images come to you in a kind of rush, come to you kind of subconsciously, and I guess it's through the act of turning them into words and putting them down on paper that you start to make those choices as to what you actually use and what you discard.
Alors, sans raconter la fin du livre,
without revealing the end of the book for those of you who haven't read it, but you reuse that image at the very end of the book. The image of the escalator comes back in the last pages, and the whole book is also a homage to I.L. Diamond, the scriptwriter that wrote a lot of the Billy Wilder, and it's also a homage to Billy Wilder in the way the book is written, but also in its structure. So when you have this first image of the escalator, do you have the end already? in your head, and do you have this idea that this image will come back? Was something very, and I don't want to go into detail, but something very moving, because I don't want to spoil the end, but there's a last line in the book which is extremely moving and which is a homage to the work of Wilder and Diamond, but also loops the loops, if you like. So several questions in my question. The first one is, did you have the end in mind? And was the structure a homage to the work of Diamond and Wilder?
Again, it varies from book to book. Sometimes I don't have even the ending of the book in mind when I start writing the book. It's certainly not the final sentence, but this book was different. I did have the final sentence in mind, and yeah, that was a kind of homage to Wilder, because among other great things about his films, they're full of some of the greatest final lines in the movies. You know, at the end of Some Like It Hot, you have Nobody's Perfect. At the end of The Apartment, you have Shut Up and Deal. At the end of Sunset Boulevard, you have Mr. DeMille, I'm ready for my close-up now. I mean, it's hard to think of many other writer-directors whose final lines are so memorable and have become so widely quoted. So I wanted, if I could, to end the novel in a way that would pay tribute to his genius with final lines. So yeah, I did have that in mind in this case. With other things, you know, one of the things that gives you a sense, you hope as you begin a book, that the book is going to work and is going to be finished and is going to pan out roughly how you want it to, is the sense that the images you use are starting to fall into place and to form patterns and to make a kind of sense. And so yes, you know, it wasn't a plan to use the escalator image again towards the end of the book, but when it happened, then it felt right, and it made me feel that, okay, this book is beginning to take shape, if you like.
Alors, est-ce que, comme vous venez de le lire,
you just read it, so we have Calista, the character, thinks about cinema all the time. Whenever she meets someone or whatever happens to her, it reminds her of films. The question is easy. Is it your case, too? I presume yes, so maybe we can move on to the next question, but does your love of cinema haunts your everyday life? It's very present in your writing, but it's also very present in your everyday life?
Yeah, I mean, all the central characters in my books are based on me to one degree or another, whether I'm writing in a male voice or in a female voice. And Callista, I think, even though she's a half Greek woman who for most of the novel is only in her 20s, she's very, very close to me, and very much a memory of what I was like at that age. And so yes, her compulsion to see everything in cinematic terms, which is something that develops throughout the book, because at the beginning of the book she has no interest in cinema really, and she doesn't know who Billy Wilder is before she meets him. She's seen very few films, in fact, but of course the experience of working with him makes her a fan and a cinephile and a kind of obsessive watcher of films. So she quickly, like me, begins to see everything that happens in real life as an echo of a film. And as anyone will know who has seen the film Don't Look Now, which we screened here as part of my choices a couple of nights ago, the image of the little girl in the red hooded Mac at the beginning of that film is incredibly haunting and incredibly memorable. And you know, every time I see a little blonde-haired boy or girl at the age of 7 or 8, whether they're wearing a red Mac or not these days, that's one of the things I think about.
Dans Billy Wilder et moi, il y a
in Mr. Wilder and Me, the book is divided in two, and there's a screenplay that we read about the youth of Billy Wilder. What would be the main difference between novel writing and screenplay writing? And it'll be my last question before I give the floor to the audience.
Well, I can't write screenplays, not real screenplays. I've tried. One of my early novels, The Dwarves of Death, Les Nains de l'Amour, was adapted for cinema, and I wrote most of the drafts of the screenplay myself, and it was a very terrible experience for everybody concerned. Writing a screenplay and writing a novel, they're such different disciplines. What I like about the novel is the total formal freedom it gives you, that you can write a novel of 150 pages or a novel of 1,000 pages if you want to. There's no obligation to make every page count in the same way that every page of a 120-page screenplay has to count. You don't have to be nearly so economical in the way that you use dialogue. You can take your time over conversations. You can digress. The narrative line doesn't have to be as propulsive. I mean, there are many, many differences. And what I discovered through the experience of trying to adapt that book into a movie was that I can write novels, but I can't write screenplays. However, there is what looks like a screenplay at the heart of Mr. Wilder and Me, but it's a strange kind of hybrid, I think, because I don't think it could be shot as I've written it. In fact, I'm sure it couldn't be. But it goes back to the question you asked before about, how do you find ways of changing perspective in the course of a novel? I knew that the story I really wanted to tell in Mr. Wilder and Me was the story of Billy Wilder's flight from Nazi Germany in the 30s, his year in Paris in 33, 34, and then how he left Paris to go to America and become a Hollywood screenwriter and director. But of course, Callista can't tell that story because she wasn't there when any of this happened. Only Wilder himself could tell that story. And somehow I had to find a way of doing that. So I remembered or realized that everything Wilder had written, once he became a screenwriter, was in the form of a screenplay. He didn't do any journalism after that. He never wrote essays. He never gave lectures. He gave a lot of interviews. And he wrote a lot of screenplays. So I could have done it as an interview, I guess. But I thought it would be more interesting, more challenging, more in keeping with his way of expressing himself, to try and write it not as a screenplay to be filmed, but as a screenplay to be read. So that's what it is.
Alors on a un petit peu de temps pour que vous puissiez.
So we have some time for you to have a conversation, to ask questions to Mr. Coe. We have a mic going around the audience. Who wants to start?
Vous avez dit voilà, forcément c'est dans l'ombre. Tout en bas ici, si on peut avoir un micro, sinon je vais me déplacer pour donner le micro. J'ai peut-être pris de vitesse un petit peu. Donc j'arrive.
Merci. Bonsoir. At one point you said that nowadays it was no longer accessible for writers to use the 19th century omniscient narrator. Why is that?
I didn't say it was unacceptable. I said it was difficult. I think it's because we've become much more aware in all sorts of ways and through many different approaches to understanding ourselves. From psychoanalysis to whatever, that all experience is subjective, and we all see reality in a completely different way. I think this has become very clear and kind of alarmingly clear in the last year, in particular. For me anyway, when you see anti-vaxxers protesting every weekend on the streets of Paris or the streets of London, and you realize that there are people out there who see the world in a way that bears no relation to the way in which other people see it. We have radically, fundamentally different concepts of what is reality and what isn't. And I think we're all so aware of the subjectivity of our different perceptions of how the world is, that for me, anyway, it feels uncomfortable for a writer to come along and say, yes, I can take an Olympian view of all this, I can write with equal authority and understanding about people of every background, every ethnicity, every gender, and, I understand the world in its totality, and I'm going to share my vision with you. In a way, I just don't think readers kind of buy that anymore. And so, how that manifests itself is that the narrative voice in which people used to take that position, as earlier, I mentioned the great 19th century novelists like Balzac and Dickens, just doesn't feel available to me anymore. I feel that if I want to produce a portrait of society or a country or my particular group of characters that is wide-ranging and encompasses a lot of different viewpoints, then I have to do that kind of piece by piece, if you like, almost like a jigsaw puzzle, and eventually, by putting those different pieces together, then you will get a total picture, but you can't do it by playing God and adopting an Olympian tone of voice.
D'autres réactions ou questions? Cette fois-ci, le micro est arrivé.
Other reactions or questions? Now the mic is here.
Là-bas. Voilà. Le micro arrive.
Mic is coming.
Bonsoir. Ma question portait sur des adaptations.
Good evening. My question is about the possible adaptations of your work. You know that for the trilogy there was a series. Do you consider that your novels cannot be adapted in cinema, and why?
I think some of them can be adapted and some are more difficult. Many years ago, I wrote a book called The House of Sleep, La Maison du Sommeil, and this is full of scenes which critics and readers have described as cinematic. And I know exactly what they mean by that, but the novel as a whole has always proved very difficult to adapt. There have been many different attempts by different writers, including myself, and it's never worked. And I was very pleased a few weeks ago to see an article in a newspaper which was headed 5 novels which could never be adapted for the screen, and The House of Sleep was one of them. I thought that was very true. Having said that, we just sold the film rights, so someone else can have a go at it. I think I remember Hitchcock saying that his method of adapting a piece of literature, a story, or whatever, or a book, was to read it once for the story and then to put the book aside and just to remember the outlines of the narrative and completely to rethink it in cinematic terms. And I really think that is the way to do it. When Billy Wilder made the 7-Year Itch, with which he wrote with George Axelrod, who wrote the play that the film is adapted from, Axelrod turned up at Wilder's office on the first day with the play, the original play, typescript, and Wilder took one look at it and said, "I'm really glad that you brought that. That will be very, very useful." And he put it on the floor and wedged the door open with it and said, "I need a doorstop." Because he didn't want to think about the play at all in any detail. He'd seen it once in the theatre and that was enough. He was going to reimagine it as a film. And, if you're adapting a novel which has already worked on its own terms as a piece of literature, then that's not necessarily the right approach. And this is why I think classic novels, great novels, serious novels often don't make successful films. The best films that are adapted from works of literature are often adapted from very slight pieces, like Don't Look Now, which is based on a short story, or Hitchcock's The Birds, which is based on another very short Daphne du Maurier story. Or they're adapted from novels which have the germ of an interesting idea, but have somehow failed in some way, and maybe a movie adaptation can improve that, can find a way of telling that story cinematically, which makes it work in a way that it didn't work on the page. In terms of my own books, the problems filmmakers have is that they jump about too much in time, they jump about too much in terms of viewpoint and perspective, and although they have individual scenes in them which seem cinematic, it's challenging to adapt them to the cinema because they don't fit, they don't sit very comfortably with mainstream cinema narrative. The Rotters Club was adapted for television and worked pretty well on television, I thought, but that's because it's one of my simplest books in some ways. The storytelling is very linear and straightforward. I think sometimes my books look very tempting to filmmakers because they're full of cinematic moments. But actually, that's not enough to make an adaptation from. You need a book which really lends itself to the cinematic form, and in a lot of cases, my books don't really do that.
Merci. Une dernière question. Oui, au centre. Au milieu, au centre.
Bonjour, je voulais savoir que pensez-vous du cinéma de
I'd like to know what you think about Ken Loach films and the resonance between English identity. Well, don't know what resonance, but English identity.
Of course, when I was asked to choose 12 films to reflect Britain by the Forum des Images, I had to choose a Ken Loach film because he's been one of the great chroniclers of British life over the last half a century, really, I suppose, since the mid-60s. So yeah, or more. Most of his, I talked about the difference between the realistic and the poetic tradition in British filmmaking, and I would say, for the most part, he's part of the realistic tradition. I think my favorite film of his actually is Kes, his film from the late 1960s, which, as well as being a brilliant and authentic portrait of the way of life that film shows, also has great moments of lyricism and release in the scenes with the boy and the young kestrel. I think it's a very beautiful film from that point of view. I met him just once a few years ago when we did an event together at a university, and he hadn't read any of my novels, and he is very nice, very kind, very generous man, so he felt bad about this and said, "Will you send me one?" So I sent him what was then my latest novel, which was a book called Number 11, Numero 11. And I will give the ending of the book away, but this was, of all my recent books, maybe of all my books altogether, this is the one where I most tried to break away from realism, and the book ends with an attack by rampaging giant spiders. And I sent it to Ken Loach, and he wrote me back a really nice letter saying, "I really enjoyed this book, and I'm very much in sympathy with the politics of the book, but I'm not going to adapt it because I don't make films with giant spiders in them." And maybe that's a shame. Maybe what we need now is a Ken Loach film ending with an attack by giant spiders. I would like to see him. I would like to see him have a crack at that, but sadly, it's not going to happen.
Eh bien, merci. Je vous propose que l'on termine.
Thank you very much. I would like to finish with some images. Of course, there are other films, your desert island films that you had chosen. There were 5 of them, and one of them is the film that you've been obsessed with. The Private Life of Sherlock Holmes, Billy Wilder's film at 9 p.m. But now I would like to finish this conversation with a passage of another film of a great British director, 2 directors, Pressburger and Michael Powell. I know where I'm going. Can you say a few words just about this film? We'll show it tomorrow. There's a screening.
Yeah, this is a film from the 1940s, made during the war, and it's a very unique British film, I think. Quite hard to classify in some ways. In some ways, it's a romantic comedy. Maybe that's the best way to talk about it, but at the same time, it has a very, very powerful sense of the Scottish landscape, because it's about a wealthy woman from England who goes up to Scotland to get married to a rich Englishman who has recently bought a Scottish island for himself. And Powell and Pressburger, Emmerich Pressburger was a Hungarian immigrant to the UK who has a small part in my novel Mr. Wilder and Me, because he also knew Billy Wilder in Berlin and in Paris before he came to the UK. And maybe it was Pressburger's involvement that made Michael Powell a different kind of English director, because they wrote their screenplays together. Pressburger usually thought of the stories, and the stories that they'd filmed are very strange. There's another beautiful one, which I could equally have chosen, called A Matter of Life and Death, which is about a patient on the operating table having an operation which may or may not save his life. And the film takes place inside his head, and half of it is set in heaven, which is filmed in black and white, and half of it is set on Earth, which is filmed in Technicolor. And these films were very unusual for British cinema at the time in their imagination, in their eccentricity, in their excess sometimes, because they didn't go in for kind of British restraint and stiff upper lipness. The films are wild and eccentric and unpredictable. Powell then disgraced himself in the British establishment's eyes by making a film in 1960 called Peeping Tom, which is a rather graphic study of violence and voyeurism, which was considered obscene and beyond the pale, and fell into neglect until he was rediscovered in the late 70s by many film historians, including Martin Scorsese, who became a great champion of Michael Powell's films and helped and paid for the restoration of some of them. But he's, I don't know how well known he is in France, but he's one of our greatest directors, I think. And although I Know Where I'm Going isn't one of his epic films, it is one of the most perfectly realized and one of the most delightful and entertaining.
Et la veuve de Michael Powell, Thelma Schoonmaker, est...
His widow, Thelma Schoonmaker, is Scorsese's editor.
Indeed, yeah.
Oui. Alors, il me reste, avant que l'on voit cet extrait...
Now, before watching this clip, I just wish to thank the interpreters in the booth, Massoumé and Hervé.
Yes.
No, it's Yves.
Yves and Massoumé, thank you so much. Amazing.
Thank you, it's a great pleasure. Thank you. Thank you to Muriel Dreyfus, who helped me prepare this conversation. Maybe we can cheer her too. And thank you to our staff and to Gallimard Publishing. And now we're going to watch the clip. And thank you, Jonathan Coe.
donc l'extrait numéro 3, Je sais où je vais.
Clip number 3.
Il y a une dédicace juste après.
And then there's a book signing session.
Avec une librairie avec quelques livres de Jonathan. Je sais où je vais, à la dédicace donc.
Port Eric is down yonder behind the trees. That is my castle, the ancient home of the MacLeans of Eric.
Where do they live now?
Down there in Eric House. Ah, but they'll all be dead now or in New Zealand. There will only be Katrina MacLean.
Is anyone allowed in the castle?
Oh, yes, anybody can go in, except the lairds of Killoran. There's a curse on them.
What sort of a curse?
If they should ever set foot across the threshold. Man, they say it's a terrible strong curse. Oh, machine! Here!
I'd better go down.
Will I take them for you?
Oh, no, thank you. I can manage.
I'd better wait a wee while. Rory Moore may not be willing to cross over to Killoran in this weather.
Oh, no, my fiancé's coming over to fetch me.
Oh, so the rich gentleman in spectacles is your fiancé?
Yes.
She'll finish, do you tell me? Well, well, 1,000 blessings on you both.
Thank you.
But in a fog like the one that's coming up, your fiancé won't see any better with 6 pairs of spectacles than with 1.
Goodbye.
Bien achleg.
Good evening.
Oh. Bad luck, no crossing today.
But isn't that the boat from Killoran?
No.
And if she was, it is not today she'd be getting back, my lady.
That's the ferry boat. Pity you didn't keep Ian's car, that's why I was shouting.
But we didn't understand. Why should I keep it anyway?
To go back to Tobermory and spend the night in a comfortable bed.
But I intend to spend the night on Killoran.
Oh. Would you like to wait up at the house? I know the people.
Thank you. But it's been arranged for the boat to meet me here, and I'd better be here to meet it.
Good. It's the big house up the brae. Hier is de wet nog Oliver.
Fisker mag, Lauren.
Vier kan we maar, hè?
Wie be Beckel, Lauren? Is that Gaelic you're talking?
Yes, my lady. What would it be but the Gaelic?
What's that noise? That would be the seals singing. The seals?
Yes, yes, they like the warm, foggy weather.
If my boat doesn't come, will you take me?
No, I will not, my lady.
Port Eric, 5:15 p.m. A motorboat from Killoran will meet Miss Webster.
Good evening. I'm looking for the house. You see we gate. Up the brae. Thank you.